19.
The question is, will the House, on reconsideration, pass the joint resolution, the objections of the President to the contrary notwithstanding? The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, is recognized for 1 hour.
Madam Speaker, for the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves, ranking member of the House Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks, insert extraneous material on the veto message of the President of the United States to the joint resolution H.J. Res. 46.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, today we will vote to override the President's veto of Congress's bipartisan action to terminate his so-called national emergency declaration. Bottom line is that this emergency declaration is nothing more than an end run around a majority, bipartisan majority, of both the House and the Senate, in complete disregard of our constitutional system of separation of powers. There's no doubt that we have a broken immigration system, and comprehensive reform should be a subject of congressional deliberation. But today, in particular, we have a new crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis. But the President has said that this wall will solve that problem. And he also says that this is about drugs. Well, let's talk about that, if we could. Here we have walls are static. You know, it's very old technology, been used for many, many, many centuries. But as we know, most recently, when the French built the Maginot Line, the Germans went around it in 24 hours. Similar to what the President is proposing. He wants a wall on part of the border. Well, if the problem were people illegally crossing, they would cross in other areas where there is no wall. But that's actually not the case. He says that this will stop the flood of people who are coming to the border. These are not the historic people who were crossing the border illegally to come to the United States for the purposes of work and to remit funds home, or those who were illegally smuggling drugs through remote areas. This is a humanitarian crisis. This is recently in Tijuana, of a flood of people coming actually to areas where we have walls and fences and wanting to surrender to the Border Patrol and claim asylum, or coming to places where we don't have walls and fences and searching for Border Patrol agents so they can claim asylum. So a wall is going to do nothing to deal with the humanitarian crisis, and we need to take a much more thoughtful approach to that. But secondly, he says it's about drugs. He makes a big deal about this is contributing to the deaths and the opioid crisis, fentanyl and all that. Well, of course, the Chinese are shipping in fentanyl in other ways. It's not coming across the Mexican border, and maybe we ought to do something about that. But we have tried with walls to prevent the smuggling of drugs. The drug smugglers are very creative. They've used rather primitive devices. That's a catapult. They have used drones. They frequently use tunnels. But we found out in the trial of El Chapo Guzman that their preferred route is not some remote area which is unwalled, but actually to come across at the legal border crossings here. And it's such a big business, it's like they can modify a semi-tractor trailer, put in a fake floor, and send 10 in a day. We only inspect 1 out of 10, and so therefore they get 9 through. They lost 1 truck, millions of dollars worth of drugs in a truck. They don't care. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. We need new tools and technology at the legal border crossings. In particular, we need that so we can scan 100% of the vehicles. We're going to have to reconfigure the border crossings. We have to bring in the equipment. We have to hire more personnel. These are very expensive undertakings. Instead, we're going to waste money on a static wall, which isn't going to stop the drugs. And even more than that, you can put that down now. The Coast Guard, the former commandant of the Coast Guard, testified that they have actionable intelligence, they think, on about 80% of the maritime drug shipments targeting the U.S., mostly from Central America, some from other Asian Pacific areas. And they can only act on 1/5 of the actionable intelligence because they don't have the personnel. They don't have the ships. They don't have the helicopters. They don't have the tools they need to interdict those maritime drug shipments. So we're going to waste money on a stupid static wall. Meanwhile, the drugs are going to flood in on a maritime basis or through the legal border crossings. Now, last year, this is supposedly a crisis, and somehow it wasn't a crisis when the Republicans controlled the Congress up until the beginning of this year. They refused to appropriate funds for the wall, and then the president shut down the government for 35 days, longest government shutdown in our nation's history. 800,000 people were either denied coming to work or had to work without pay. Finally, the president agreed to open the government with a short-term continuing resolution, and he said that lawmakers should come up with a comprehensive border security proposal. Well, Congress did that. A bipartisan group delivered compromise legislation, rejected the proposed border wall as ineffective. Alternatively, it made effective, robust investments in border security. Congress overwhelmingly passed the legislation. The president agreed to sign it. Then he issued a national emergency declaration in order to raid funds from other departments to secure funding for a border wall. Congress has repeatedly voted against. And as already said, he's made it about drugs. The wall will be ineffective. He's made it about the humanitarian crisis. The wall will be ineffective. And how's he going to pay for it? Well, he's going to take money that the Department of Defense was going to spend on high-priority military construction projects, which will ultimately undermine the training, readiness, and quality of life for our men and women in the armed forces. In fact, General Robert Neller, Commandant of the Marines, has detailed that the unplanned, unbudgeted shift of funds to deploy troops to the southern border last fall has forced them to cancel or reduce training exercises, delay urgent repairs, posing an unacceptable risk to our armed forces' training and readiness. And then he's also going to take, ironically, drugs, money from the DoD drug interdiction program, which will further inhibit the capability of DoD from effectively interdicting drug shipments in favor of a stupid static wall. This emergency declaration also violates a number of existing laws. The Military Construction Codification Act only authorizes the Secretary of Defense to reallocate funds for construction projects during a national emergency if the project is necessary to support a use of the armed forces. Our armed forces are not responsible for enforcing our immigration laws, and using these funds in this way is a direct violation of the existing law. The administration would also need to seize thousands of acres of private property by eminent domain to build his wall. This is the party of private property rights and local control, and they're going to support that activity, or some are. Currently, more than 2/3 of border property needed to build the wall is owned by private parties or relevant states. In 1952, the Supreme Court held in Youngstown Sheet and Tube that President Truman's declaration of national emergency, even in the midst of an international armed conflict, did not permit him to unilaterally seize private property. So it's unlikely that this thing will get built anyway, but we're going through this process. Because of this likely illegal overreach, the House passed a bipartisan resolution to terminate the national emergency declaration. Even the Republican-controlled Senate passed the resolution, with 12 Republican senators breaking with the president. With the president's decision to override this resolution, we must send a strong, clear message to the president. We live in a constitutional, representative democracy. The president and his administration cannot ignore Congress and existing law when they don't like our actions. We must stand up and defend our constitutional system, separation of powers, and Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the President's veto of House Joint Resolution 46. Keeping our nation secure should be this President's very highest priority, and it is this President's very highest priority. With President Trump, there's no question that he has and he will continue to carry out this priority, and I support his efforts to build a wall on the southern border to protect our country. He has very clearly laid out the case for a declaration for a national emergency. There is a crisis at the border, a crisis that could have been addressed much sooner or even prevented for that matter. The open border policies of the last administration compounded this growing problem. We're seeing the highest rates of illegal immigration since 2007. In February, there were more than double the number of illegal migrants coming into this country as compared to last year. Border Patrol has apprehended over 268,000 individuals since the beginning of this fiscal year. That's a 97% increase from the previous year. Schools, hospitals, other services have become overcrowded. The American workers have been hurt by reduced job opportunities and lower wages. And at the same time, human and drug traffickers are thriving. In many of our communities, the notorious MS-13 gang has grown. We've seen tragic cases of crimes committed by illegal aliens who have been deported multiple times. In my own home state of Missouri, an individual who was previously deported returned here illegally and was charged in several violent incidents. He's now suspected of murdering 5 individuals or 5 Americans. That should never have happened. These kinds of tragic and preventable, I might add, events are happening across this country. That is the very definition of a crisis. Last Congress, we enacted legislation to deal with the devastating opioid crisis because it is, in fact, also a crisis. We can and we must do more to slow the flow of illegal drugs into this country. The men and women who put their lives on the line every single day to secure our borders deserve all the tools they need to do the job, including a border wall. Through President Trump's proclamation and his veto of House Joint Resolution 46, he is acting decisively to finally address this crisis under the authority provided him by Congress. The National Emergency Act is crystal clear. Provisions the President will use under Title X explicitly provide the President with that authority. The President is well within his legal authority that Congress has provided him. That's the bottom line. I urge my colleagues to stand with the President, stand with law-abiding Americans and law-abiding immigrants to sustain this veto. With that, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, Chairman of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of overriding the President's veto of H.J. Res. 46. 1 month ago, the House passed a bipartisan resolution to terminate the so-called national emergency declared by President Trump. The Senate has likewise voted on a broad bipartisan basis to reject that emergency declaration, leading President Trump to issue the first veto of his presidency. I am more convinced than ever that the President's actions are not only unlawful, they are deeply irresponsible. A core foundation of our system of government and of democracies across the world going back hundreds of years is that the executive cannot unilaterally spend taxpayers' money without the legislature's consent. The President shredded that concept when he declared an emergency after he failed to get his way in a budget negotiation. And as he often does, he announced his intention to ignore Congress in plain sight for all the world to see. Meanwhile, hundreds of Americans have started receiving letters from the federal government demanding entry into their land. Soon our fellow citizens' backyards may be seized in order to build a medieval border wall that the Congress and the American people do not want. The senseless diversion of military resources to the southern border has also created concern about our troops' combat readiness and their ability to implement other key priorities. And the administration appears to be deciding on the fly which military construction projects they're planning to raid, leaving our men and women in uniform and everyone else who might be affected in a prolonged state of uncertainty. This type of chaos and confusion is the inevitable result when the President ignores the express will of Congress. The Judiciary Committee recently held a hearing to discuss the National Emergencies Act and to begin considering reforms to check abuses of this power. I was heartened by the enthusiasm on both sides of the aisle for such efforts, and I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on these proposals. But these longer-term reform efforts should not detract from our responsibility to address what the President is doing right now. President Trump's invention of a so-called national emergency to suit his political goals and to get around Congress' refusal of a funding request is intolerable. and I will be proud to cast my vote to override his veto. I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, at this time I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, who's also the lead Republican on the Rail Subcommittee.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Missouri for his leadership on this issue. Today, the House will vote on whether or not to override the President's veto, preserving the emergency declaration regarding the ongoing crisis at the southern border. And I'm glad we finally acknowledged on a bipartisan basis that there is, in fact, a crisis on the southern border. My friend from Oregon mentioned that this humanitarian crisis exists, and I couldn't agree more. But there's also another crisis. There's also another crisis at the border. There's been a 295% increase in apprehensions of illegal immigrants crossing our southwest border from beyond Mexico, particularly Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, over the last 10 years, roughly. There's been 266 arrests of criminal aliens in the last 2 fiscal years alone, and these include criminal aliens charged or convicted of assaults, sex crimes, and killings, and those are hardly victimless crimes. And in 2017, more than 70,000 Americans died of drug overdoses as methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl are flooding across the border. And I would say that probably the families of those 70,000 would argue that we certainly do have a crisis attributed to the problems at our southern border. Since fiscal year 2012, CBP has seized more than 11 million pounds of drugs between ports of entry. That's compared with only 4 million pounds at ports of entry. Make no mistake, there is a crisis at our southern border. Since October of last year, illegal crossings have spiked. In February alone, the month that President Trump declared the emergency, 76,000 people illegally crossed the border. Just yesterday, the Border Patrol took the highly unusual step of closing inland border checkpoints in response to abnormally high apprehensions. All of this goes to show that we need a border wall. The Customs and Border Protection Commissioner put it best when he said this is clearly both a border security and a humanitarian crisis. The President attempted to remedy this crisis by declaring the emergency, an action well within his statutory authority and constitutional obligation to protect our country. I urge my colleagues to oppose this veto override, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Adriana Espilat.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Madam Speaker. President Trump continues to push for his useless medieval wall along the southern border in defiance of Congress, despite a bipartisan vote in the House of Representatives and the Senate to reject this fraudulently invoked emergency declaration, which would rob taxpayers' funds from other programs. Congress has asserted its authority, but the President is using every tool he has in his toolbox for his pet project. Let me remind the American people, there is no emergency in the southern border. There is no emergency, Madam Speaker, in the southern border or anywhere else that warrants this wall. The head of the U.S. Northern Command, who is responsible for troops on the border, testified that border crossings do not pose a military threat. The refugees arriving at our border are families, mothers, fathers with their children. They're willingly turning themselves in to request asylum from the violence and harassment from gangs they face in their home countries. No wall, no matter how high it's built, would change that reality. Madam Speaker, this is nothing more than a naked power grab. And if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle truly stand for limited executive power, I expect them all to vote to override the President's veto today. Madam Speaker, there is no emergency in the southern border. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, at this time, I would yield Mr. Mitchell from Michigan 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, most Americans, maybe not everyone on the other side of the aisle, will not deny that we have a crisis at the border. Some of my colleagues actually recognize the crisis, including the humanitarian crisis. Last year, I voted for a bill that would have fully funded the wall and averted the government shutdown, to no avail. My choice this term would have been to pass the 6 non-controversial bills and then pass a continuing resolution for the Department of Homeland Security so we continue to work and negotiate on a resolution that would not have put us at this point. Yes, the President declared a national emergency. Speaker Pelosi then proceeds with a resolution condemning President Trump's emergency declaration, which was a messaging bill by the Democrats. And voting for it would have been playing politics, which many in this chamber chose to do. Voted today without the votes to override is yet another messaging bill, yet another game of politics, which I will not support. I agree with my colleague on the other side of the aisle. It is a constitutional question, and constitutional authority, determination of that, is something left to the courts to decide, something the Supreme Court should decide, and not a partisan whack job in the House of Representatives. If Congress wishes to narrow and define more clearly the National Emergency Act, we should do so. And in fact, I'm happy to participate in doing that. However, in the interim, we still have the issue of securing our border. It will not go away. The crisis is not going away. And as my colleagues over here have indicated, it continues to be a growing problem. So why we don't spend time in addressing that rather than one more messaging vote, which appears to be the trend right now in the House since January, befuddles me. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the resolution to override the veto, and I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let's get down to dealing with the problems of the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I will yield 2 minutes to our colleague from Texas, Joaquin Castro.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I first want to say thank you to my colleagues in the House, Republicans and Democrats, and also in the United States Senate, who voted to terminate the President's emergency declaration to build a border wall across the U.S.-Mexico border. There is a humanitarian crisis at the border, but there isn't an invasion, and there's not an emergency of the sort that the President speaks of. What we have here is an act of constitutional vandalism. The President trying to take the power away from the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, the executive trying to steal the power of the purse from the Congress. And if Congress allows this to stand 15, 20 years, 30 years from now, we will look back upon this as a time that gave both Democratic and Republican presidents incredible power to ignore Congress and completely go around this body to do the things that they will in terms of domestic politics. There are landowners in Texas that are going to lose their land. This is the largest federal land taking of Texas land, I believe, in history. Many people in Texas will lose their land. Many people will have their land values devalued, some of them very significantly because of this. Military construction projects in Texas are also at stake. $265 million worth of Texas military construction projects. At Joint Base San Antonio, which includes those in my district, $76 million. At Fort Bliss, over $50 million. Over $42 million at Fort Hood. The Red River, $71.5 million. In Galveston at the Naval Reserve, $8.4 million. Gone because the President has decided, and this Congress will have submitted to his will, to go around Congress and unilaterally build a border wall. Even those who support a wall should agree with us that this is not the way to do it. Congress funded over $1 billion, yet the President has gone around them to do more. I hope my colleagues will stand with us and override this veto.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, at this time, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For 43 years, the President of the United States has had the statutory authority granted by Congress to declare a national emergency and to reprogram unobligated military construction funds to meet that emergency. 58 times previous presidents have invoked this authority to address such matters as civil unrest in Sierra Leone and Burma. Only when this president invoked his authority for the 59th time to address the most serious national security risk our country has faced in our lifetimes, the collapse of our southern border, do we now hear protests from the left and its fellow travelers. Madam Speaker, under our Constitution, the Congress appropriates money but cannot spend it, and the President spends money but cannot appropriate it. He spends it according to laws given to him by Congress. In this case, Congress appropriated funds and delegated to the President precisely the authority to spend those funds that he is now exercising. Now, whether Congress should have delegated this authority is a separate question that no one has raised in 43 years. But while that authority exists, the President has both a right and a duty to use it to defend our country. We also hear protests from that the President's act will divert money from other military projects. Listen to what these people are saying. They care more about defending the Iraqi border than defending our own. Such people should not be entrusted with the defense of our country. I stand with the President, who is acting within our Constitution to defend our nation, and against the radical left in this House that would dissolve our borders entirely if given the chance. History warns us that nations that cannot or will not defend their borders aren't around very long. Let that not be the epitaph of the American Republic or the Constitution that created it. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Just in response to the gentleman, if he had been listening, he might have heard the gentleman from Texas listing bases in Texas which are going to lose funds for critical military construction projects, yet he launches off into some fantasy that we're something about Iraq. I didn't even quite get that part, and also that we're proposing open borders. I'm not aware of anyone on this side of the aisle who is proposing open borders. We are proposing effective 21st century border security at the real threats to America, like drug importation through our legal ports of entry and maritime drug imports that we can't intercept because we don't have the resources, and we're wasting money on a stupid static wall. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. My colleague on the other side of the aisle said this was a partisan whack job. Yet, Congress has come together, which is rare to see these days, on a bipartisan basis in the House and on the Senate to vote to terminate this alleged crisis that's happening at the border. This is a constitutional issue. This is about the separation of powers. This is about Congress's ability to appropriate money, and the President saying, we want something, Congress doesn't give it to him, and him going around Congress. Again, this is not a partisan issue. This should not be a partisan issue. My Republican colleague in the Senate said, and I quote, never has a president asked for funding and then had Congress not provide the funding just to have the president come right back to use the National Emergencies Act to get around Congress. This is a dangerous precedent. This is not a messaging vote. Again, on the House and the Senate side, on a bipartisan basis. Our colleagues are arguing today that we should stand with the President. I ask you, stand with the Constitution. Stand with the Constitution. Let's override this veto. A wall will not stop the drugs that are coming in, majority through the ports of entry. A wall will not stop migrants who are coming to present themselves for asylum legally at the ports of entry. And a wall will not stop the inhumane treatment that migrants are receiving at the ports of entry. Let's work together on a comprehensive immigration bill. Let's work together to address this problem, not to fund a wall against the will of Congress, which is being done on a bipartisan basis, on a bicameral basis. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the President made it very clear that the wall is critical to address both national security and the humanitarian crisis. DOD issued a fact sheet of the universe of projects that have not been awarded, and they total more than what is needed. They total about $12 billion, a little over $12 billion. And just because a project is listed doesn't mean that the funding will be used. They only need $3.6 billion. And I might add, too, that if the fiscal year 2020 budget is enacted on time and as requested, there is going to be no military construction project that's going to be delayed or canceled. With that, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abraham.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, the President, he has a duty to protect our borders and our people. He has the Constitution and the law of the land on his side to declare this national emergency. Democrats have blocked the appropriations for this border security, but they had no problem when President Obama built 130 miles of border wall. When they play political games, 76,000 people alone in February stream across our borders. But the United States has endured because we are a land that believes in the rule of the law. Turning a blind eye to this law and allowing these open borders sends the wrong message to the American people and our laws. Madam Speaker, I am a country physician that has unfortunately been in emergency rooms and in funeral homes with the families of those that have died of illegal opioid overdoses. And when we play political games with American lives and American families, shame on us. 85 to maybe 95% of these illegal opioids come across the southern border where we have no fence. We have no barrier for these illegal people to bring these drugs in. We've got to secure this border with a wall. Let the President secure our border, let the President protect our people, and let's vote against this veto override. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I would yield myself such time as I may consume. I was just looking up, most of the deaths, or many, are due to fentanyl. And the fentanyl, of course, is all produced in China. Some of it is shipped via UPS, FedEx, and the International Postal Service. And we lack the screening capability to deal with that. Much of it does go to Mexico, and it is then smuggled into the U.S. But it's not the classic myth of these are people carrying backpacks, through remote areas of the desert where if we only put up a wall, the wall would stop them from getting the drugs into the U.S. If people had paid attention to the extraordinary trial of El Chapo Guzman in New York, which I did, there was testimony after testimony after testimony. He's bringing, and his successors, are bringing the drugs through our ports of entry because they deal in volume and sophistication. And what are we going to do? We're going to build a medieval wall over here while they continue to flood this country by modifying pickup trucks, passenger cars, semis to smuggle humans and drugs into the United States of America. Border Patrol is understaffed. Border Patrol does not have adequate technology. They only screen a very small percentage of the vehicles coming through, sometimes 6%, sometimes as high as 8%. Wow! Well, then you get a 92% chance if you are El Chapo Guzman or some other scumbag drug person from a cartel in Mexico of getting your product in an efficient, volumetric way. Why would you pay someone with a backpack to go through some remote area when you can just ship them in that way? Or you can use FedEx or UPS. If you're Chinese, you can go online and find Chinese selling fentanyl, and they will give you advice about how you should order it from them and how you can get it into the United States. Why aren't we doing something about that? The President's making a big deal about getting tough on China. They're producing all the fentanyl, and it's coming in here in many, many different ways. And this wall will do nothing to deal with that. With that, I would reserve the balance of my time. Oh, here we go.
The gentleman reserves.
And I would yield such time as she may consume, I think customarily 1 minute, to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 happy birthday minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for his enthusiastic defense of the Constitution of the United States. I rise to join my colleagues to uphold the Constitution and defend our democracy once again. The House and the Senate came together in great unity and bipartisanship to pass Congressman Joaquin Castro's resolution to reject the president's lawless power grab. Yet the president chose to continue to defy the Constitution, the Congress, and the will of the American people with a veto. At the birth of our democracy and revolution and the war, Thomas Paine wrote that the times have found us. Once again, the times have found us to defend our democracy. The times have found us to restore the founders' vision of balance of power, checks and balances, co-equal branches of government, and restore Congress's role as Article 1, the first branch. Article 1, the legislative branch. And the times have found us to honor our oath to support and defend the Constitution and protect the American people. We all know that the heart of our Constitution, the beauty of it all, is that we have a system of checks and balances. Our founders did not want a monarchy. That's what they had rejected. They wanted a democracy, co-equal branches of government to act as a check on each other. This Congress of the United States acted to honor the Constitution, our responsibility to protect and defend, by passing legislation in our appropriations bill showing how, in a bipartisan way, Congress would protect our borders. We understand our responsibility to do that. We don't take that responsibility lightly. We take it seriously. Even when the president disagreed with us, he should have accepted the bipartisan, bicameral decision to proceed. He had taken pride in a shutdown of government for about 1 month because he didn't get his way on the border. After 1 month, bipartisan, bicameral action by the Congress sent him a bill just almost exactly like what he rejected in the first place. And he decided to reject Congress's wisdom and Congress's acting with its authority to protect our borders in a serious, effective, values-based way. So we don't take this vote here today lightly. Even when the legislative branch disagrees with the executive, we respect the office the president holds and his right to veto legislation. But when those decisions violate the Constitution, then that must be stopped. Many of our colleagues from across the aisle joined last month to defend our democracy by passing Congressman Castro's privilege resolution. That happened in the House, that happened in the United States Senate. We call on all of our colleagues to simply show that same measure of respect for our Constitution today. We take an oath to the Constitution, not to the President of the United States. We take an oath that we must honor. The choice is simple, between partisanship and patriotism, between honoring our sacred oath or hypocritically, inconsistently breaking that oath. I urge a strong bipartisan yes to override this veto and yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I just need to point out that according to Customs and Border Protection, there were more illegal drugs that were captured in between those ports of entry than they were at the ports of entry. In 2012, there were 11 million pounds of illegal drugs that were seized in between those ports of entry, as opposed to 4 million pounds at those ports of entry. This is exactly why the wall is needed, so that we funnel that illegal drug trafficking to those ports rather than in between those ports of entry. And it's time that Congress gave those individuals that are on the border risking their lives to protect the United States, give them the tools that they need, and that is a border wall. And with that, I want to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, who's also the lead Republican on the Committee on Homeland Security.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the Chairman for the time. Today I rise in strong support of securing our borders. There is a crisis at the southwest border that can no longer be denied. Changing demographics have created unprecedented challenges for our Border Patrol agents. Today, record large groups of women and children from Central American countries are overwhelming Border Patrol facilities and undermining the safety of migrants and staff. Family apprehensions for fiscal year 2019 are already 800% higher than fiscal year 2013. Customs and Border Protection statistics indicate that border apprehensions are on pace to hit a 10-year high. Human smugglers are exploiting loopholes in our broken immigration system and using children as visas to gain entry into the U.S. Further, drugs are pouring through our porous borders. As you just heard the Chairman mention, in fiscal year 2018, Customs and Border Protection seized almost 900,000 pounds of drugs at the border, the majority of which were seized between the ports of entry. That includes approximately 2,000 pounds of fentanyl, which equals a lethal dose for the entire United States population. To address this crisis, we need an all-of-the-above solution to border security. It includes manpower, 21st century technology, and a barrier. With this approach, we will stem the flow of drugs that are devastating our communities. We will stop human smugglers and others from crossing hundreds of miles of open desert with innocent children. Border security used to be a bipartisan issue. I've been on the Homeland Security Committee since it was established as a select committee after 9/11. Not one time in the history of that committee has there been any partisan dispute about the need for a barrier at the wall until Donald Trump became president, and now it's a toxic issue. I stand by President Trump's actions to keep Americans safe and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Vote against the effort to override the President's veto. I thank the ranking member, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't have any more speakers, so I'm prepared to close if the gentleman's the same.
I have no further speakers on our side, so then let's see, what is the order of closing? I believe, do I get to close?
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
What? Oh, wait, excuse me, I'm reserving. What? Yeah, right. Yeah. So you go ahead and
The
vote.
gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, despite the majority's blind objection to anything this president does, the facts are clearly there to show that this is a real crisis. President Obama agreed when he requested emergency funding in 2014 to deal with the crisis on the border, and when he declared a national emergency because of the transactional drug traffickers. Since fiscal year, two transnational drug traffickers. Since fiscal year 2012, Customs and Border Patrol has seized 4 million pounds, as I pointed out earlier, seized 4 million pounds of drugs at ports of entry, but more than 11 million pounds of drugs between those ports of entry. Nearly 3 times as many drugs are seized in between those ports. Many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle recognize the need for a border wall. They voted to authorize a wall in 2006, and again they voted to authorize under President Obama in 2013. And last year we passed bipartisan legislation to address the growing impacts of opioids on our communities, drugs that continue to flow into our country through our southern border. Make no mistake, the opioid crisis is real. Earlier this month, the Centers for Disease Control issued a report noting that deaths from fentanyl have increased from 1,663 in 2011 to 18,335 deaths in 2016. This is an increase of over 1,100%. There was bipartisan agreement that there was a drug-related crisis, but now suddenly some are calling this a manufactured crisis. The National Emergencies Act has been on the books since 1976, and it's been used dozens of times, but now, suddenly, some are calling it unconstitutional. The National Emergencies Act is clear. It's absolutely clear. The President has the authority to act. The President is using the authority Congress has given him, and the President stood firm, understanding the gravity of this crisis, and issued his first presidential veto. I stand with him, and I urge my colleagues to sustain the President's veto on House Joint Resolution 46. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oregon.
May I ask how much time remains?
8.5 minutes.
Oh, I won't use that much. Okay. Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I'd like to have a quote here from someone who I think is quite prominent. When you go under, you go around, you go through it. What they need is more manpower and more technology. That was the acting chief of staff for the White House, Mick Mulvaney, when perhaps he was a little more independent as a member of the United States Congress. That was August 25th, 2015. I would ask what's changed since then. Well, he now works for the president. That's a change. Donald Trump, during his campaign, was real hardline on immigration, but he kept forgetting to mention immigration in some of his speeches. So his staff came up with a mnemonic. They said, well, he's a builder. If we say wall, he'll remember it. And the president did. It was just an afterthought. It was, how are we going to get him to give his hard line on immigration during his campaign speeches and get rousing going? Let's use the wall. The wall then became, a life unto its own as a campaign promise, not as something that's effective. As we've talked about before, the drugs, use a trebuchet or a catapult, use a drone, tunnels, really common tunnels, and of course, legal border crossings. So that's good. Thanks, Washington. This is an end conclusion to a campaign promise for his base, but not what's in the best interests of the United States of America in terms of preventing the shipment of illegal drugs. Now, I don't know where the gentleman came up with that new statistic that 3 times as many drugs were intercepted outside the ports of entry, unless he was using the Coast Guard, which he may have been, because the Coast Guard intercepted more drugs than every other agency of the federal government combined in the maritime realm. Unfortunately, as the former commandant of the Coast Guard said, we can identify 80% with our intel. 80% of the drug shipments coming in on a maritime basis, but the Coast Guard only has the resources to intercept 20%. So I guess that's probably where that statistic came from. The Coast Guard's doing a great job with inadequate resources. In the bipartisan compromise, they got some additional money for air and marine assets, 3 multi-enforcement aircraft. They could use a heck of a lot more. Why don't we get that 80%? Why don't they have resources to get that 80% that they know about? And then let's get better intel and get the other 20%. And then let's scan 100% of the vehicles coming across the border. I've been at the border when, through intuition, a Border Patrol agent found drug smuggling. I just happened to be there that day. I mean, it was just sort of like, whoa, Congressman, you might like to see this. Guy drove up to the border. He had a birthday cake and a bottle of tequila on the seat. The Border Patrol guy said, something suspicious. Take the truck over there. They scoped out the gas tank. They found big blocks of drugs in the gas tank. What was that because we had sophisticated technology and when the guy pulled the truck up, we could use that technology? No. It was the intuition of the Border Patrol agent. I said, how did you know to go and really search through that guy's vehicle? He said, well, there was nothing on his key ring. There was only one key in the ignition. He was a throwaway. The cartel was probably paying him $10,000 or something to drive that stolen or purchased pickup truck across the border concealing drugs. And the human element caught that guy. There aren't enough Border Patrol agents. They have openings. They are not adequately compensated. They weren't paid during the shutdown, but they were still working at the border. They're the first line of defense, but they also need new technology. And we can't install that technology to scan 100% of the vehicles coming through unless we invest a lot of money in improving the border crossings, because we'll have trucks backed up 100 miles back into Mexico because of the amount of commerce that comes across. So what are we going to do? We're going to build a stupid static wall over there, and we're still going to let probably 85% of the vehicles go through without applying technology. Guzman, sitting in his jail cell, is probably just chortling over this. He's saying, oh boy, are those Americans stupid. Why don't they get the technology they need to scan the cargo that we're hiding in very sophisticated ways in tractor trailers and pickup trucks and individual passenger vehicles? Why don't they intercept the drugs that are coming in through the oceans that they even know about, and they're not intercepting them? No, we're going to build a dumb wall. And by the way, when the Republicans were in charge, we had a vote on that, and it failed. If this was such a crisis and such a great idea when the Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, why didn't they make it a priority? Well, they didn't make it a priority because they thought it was a stupid idea. But now it's a political thing. This is a victory for the president. It excites his base. It energizes his base. He has to have it, so he declares a national emergency. The emergency is political. It's not national security. It's not drugs. We have a humanitarian crisis at the border. Yes, we do. And what is a wall going to do about that? They come to the border, they stand there, and they say, we want to apply for asylum in the United States. If they come across in a remote area, they hope they come across a Border Patrol agent because they want to surrender at the moment right there and get some shelter and get medical care. They're now organizing busloads to come up from Guatemala and Honduras. We're not dealing with the root problems down there, and we're not dealing with the smugglers who are now hiring very nice luxury buses as opposed to the old ride on that killer train that people used to take to come up from there with smugglers who would often rape them, kill them, rob them, whatever else. Now they've converted to let's put them in a luxury coach and they'll have rest stops and everything else. And this has become big business. Why aren't we doing something about that? The wall will do nothing about that. Nothing. Why are we going to waste billions of dollars on a medieval fortress that won't work? I urge my colleagues to vote and override the veto of the President of the United States, restore the integrity of the Congress of the United States and the appropriations process under Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is, will the House, on reconsideration, pass the joint resolution, the objections of the President to the contrary notwithstanding? Under the Constitution, the vote must be by the yeas and nays. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. The Chair lays before the House the communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, Madam, pursuant to the permission granted in Clause 2H of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, the clerk received the following message from the Secretary of the Senate on March 26, 2019 at 9:21 a.m. that the Senate passed Senate 863. Signed sincerely, Cheryl L. Johnson.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or votes objected to under Clause 6 of Rule 20. The House will resume proceedings on the postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1388.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1388, a bill to take lands in Sonoma County, California into trust as part of the reservation of the Lytton Rancheria of California and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Cook, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you again, Madam Speaker. And I ask for unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the measure under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Along with dozens of other California tribes, the Lytton Band of Pomo Indians had its relationship with the federal government terminated in 1958, resulting in the loss of its federal status and all of its tribal lands. The tribe's federally recognized status was eventually restored, but its reservation lands were not. As a result, with the exception of a small parcel of land that Congress provided for gaming in San Pablo, the tribe has been left essentially landless and without reservation since it was terminated. H.R. 1388 will address that issue by taking approximately 511 acres in Sonoma County, California, into trust as part of the reservation of the Lytton Rancheria. Of the 124 acres on the land, the tribe plans to build housing for its members as well as governmental and community facilities. Another portion of the land is currently being used for viniculture, and the tribe intends to develop more of the lands for the same purpose. In response to local concerns, the tribe has agreed that the lands will not be used for gaming. This is provided in the text of the legislation as well as in a binding memorandum of agreement with the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors. In addition to the memorandum of agreement with the County of Sonoma, the tribe has also entered into agreements with the local school district and the local fire department. Additionally, the tribe is working with the City of Windsor to ensure appropriate water and sewer hookup. By directing these lands be taken into trust, the United States will ensure that the Lytton Rancheria will finally have a permanently protected homeland on which they can once again live as a community and plan for the future. An identical bill passed the House last Congress by voice vote, and I urge quick adoption of this legislation as well, and I reserve the balance of my time, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. H.R. 1388 would provide for the acquisition of a number of acres of non-contiguous land in trust for the benefit of Lytton Rancheria. The lands located in Sonoma County, next to the town of Windsor, are the subject